On a stormy night in Lancaster, a little girl was forced by her stepmother to wash dishes outside in the cold rain. What seemed like a cruel punishment soon turned into a life-changing revelation when her father, a respected pilot, returned home earlier than expected. This is not just a story of hardship, but of truth uncovered, of redemption, and the unshakable strength of family love. My dear listeners, I truly wish you peace, health, and joy as you hear this story tonight. Tell me, from which country are you listening, and at what time of the day? Elliot Hayes stepped off the jet bridge into Philadelphia International Airport just as the last announcements echoed across the terminal. His uniform was still crisp, hat tucked beneath his arm, and his shoes tapped neatly across the tile. The flight from Lisbon had been long, but for a man used to transatlantic routes, the fatigue was something he carried quietly, as he had carried so many things in his life. He moved with the composure of a professional, yet inside, there was a hollowness he couldn't quite name. A fellow pilot caught up with him by the coffee stand near Gate C. "Man, you're lucky," the colleague said with a grin. "Great job, young wife, and a kid who adores you. What else could you want?" Elliot smiled politely, raising the steaming paper cup, but said nothing. Words like those had begun to feel like a script he was expected to follow. He wished he could believe them as easily as they were spoken. Outside, the November night pressed in. Rain streaked the windshield of the shuttle bus that carried him to the parking lot. Soon, he was guiding his sedan westward on the turnpike, 2 hours of slick asphalt stretching ahead. The wipers thudded back and forth, the world a blur of red taillights and dark fields. Farmhouses along the way glowed faintly, their porches strung with early Thanksgiving decorations. From the driver's seat, Elliot caught glimpses of carved pumpkins left too long on doorsteps, sagging under the chill. As the miles passed, his mind drifted toward Lancaster, toward the white clapboard house that waited for him. He thought of Vivienne's last call, her voice bright with hospitality as she promised a hot meal and a smile. He thought, too, of his daughter, Clara, 9 years old, quiet but observant. She was from his first marriage, left motherless when Margaret passed away. The memory of his late wife never left him. She lingered in the corners of Clara's room, in the shape of the girl's eyes, in the careful way she held a pencil when she drew. Elliot tightened his grip on the wheel as he recalled Margaret's final days. He had convinced himself, back then, that remarrying was the right choice, not just for himself, but for Clara, too. Vivienne had seemed elegant, composed, someone who could provide stability. And perhaps, he told himself, companionship might fill the cavern Margaret's absence had carved out. The rain intensified, hammering the roof of the car as he exited the highway and took the winding country roads. Lancaster's fields, bare now after harvest, stretched into shadow. The headlights swept across barns and silos, across the covered bridges that gave the county its quiet charm. To others, it might look idyllic. For Elliot, tonight it felt like driving into a memory he wasn't sure he had earned. By the time he reached the driveway, his muscles ached with fatigue. He paused before stepping out of the car, watching the golden rectangles of light glowing from the house. Through the curtains, silhouettes moved Vivienne preparing something at the counter, and behind her, a smaller figure hovering in the hallway. Elliot exhaled and forced a smile. Whatever doubts lingered, this was home now, wasn't it? He walked up the porch steps, the wooden boards creaking softly under his polished shoes. The door opened almost before he knocked. Vivienne appeared, her auburn hair carefully arranged, her red dress catching the warm glow from inside. "Welcome home, darling," she said brightly, stepping forward to kiss his cheek. Her perfume carried a note of cinnamon and wine. She looked every bit the picture of hospitality he wanted to believe in. But as she drew him into the warmth of the house, another presence tugged at him. Clara lingered just beyond the doorway, her thin frame half hidden by the wall. She clutched a drawing pad to her chest, her eyes wide, pale against the shadows. For a moment she didn't speak, only watched him with a mixture of relief and hesitation, as though she feared he might vanish again. Elliot bent down and opened his arms. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward, pressing the drawing pad tightly against her chest as though it were armor. When she reached him, she wrapped one arm around his waist while keeping the sketchbook between them. He kissed the crown of her head, smelling the faint scent of pencil shavings mixed with the rain she had tracked in earlier that evening. "It's good to see you, sweetheart," he murmured. His voice caught in his throat. Clara nodded, her cheek brushing against his uniform jacket, but she did not speak. Vivian gave a gentle laugh, filling the silence. She's just shy tonight. Come, Elliot. Dinner is ready, and you need to eat after that long flight. The warmth of the house embraced him as they entered. The dining room glowed under the light of a chandelier Vivienne had polished until it gleamed. The table was already set with roasted chicken, a loaf of crusty bread, and a bottle of red wine breathing in the center. Clara's glass of milk sat untouched at her place. They ate together, the clinking of utensils punctuating the conversation. Vivienne told stories about neighbors, about a new boutique opening in town, and about the Thanksgiving gathering she wanted to host. Her voice was lively and her smile radiant. Elliot responded with nods, offering short anecdotes from his flight, an anxious passenger, a moment of turbulence, a joke from the crew. Through it all, he noticed Clara. She picked at her food, nibbling only a few bites of bread. Her eyes wandered often to the end of the table, where an empty chair stood. Elliot knew what she was thinking. Margaret had sat there once, her hand folded gently over Clara's, encouraging her to eat, to laugh. The absence was as loud as any voice in the room. When he reached for Clara's hand under the table, she drew it back slowly, whispering, "I'm fine, Dad." He nodded, letting it go, though the lie stung. After dinner, Vivian cleared the plates with a flourish, humming softly. Elliot excused himself and walked upstairs with Clara. Her room had changed since Margaret's passing. Vivian had hung new curtains and placed a rug by the bed, but on the desk still stood a framed photograph of Margaret smiling in the sunlight. Clara lingered by it, her fingers brushing the frame. He tucked her in, smoothing the blanket across her shoulders. "Rest, my girl. Tomorrow's another day." She nodded, eyes downcast, the sketchbook still near her pillow. Elliot kissed her forehead before switching off the light. Downstairs, Vivian had lit a candle in the living room and poured glasses of wine. She handed one to Elliot, her eyes sparkling. "You're home now," she said. "Let's enjoy the evening." He sipped, but his mind was elsewhere. Something about Clara's silence stayed with him. He reminded himself that children grieve in quiet ways, that Margaret's absence weighed heavily still, yet the unease lingered like the storm clouds gathering again outside. The clock in the hallway chimed softly. Elliot leaned back in the armchair, telling himself that tomorrow he would try harder to reach Clara, to bridge whatever distance had grown. For now, he wanted to believe in the picture Vivian painted: the house, the warmth, the wine, the companionship. He wanted to believe he had chosen well. But upstairs, in the darkened bedroom, Clara lay wide awake. She opened her sketchbook beneath the glow of a small lamp. On the page, she had drawn a little girl standing under pouring rain, her face turned upward toward a sky where a plane flew past. The lines were heavy, smudged, the paper wrinkled from the pressure of her pencil. She closed the book quickly when the floor creaked. At the doorway, Vivienne stood, arms crossed, her silhouette framed by the faint hallway light. Clara froze, her heart thudding in her chest. Vivienne's eyes narrowed slightly, and though she said nothing, the air between them was sharp with unspoken authority. Clara lowered the sketchbook to her lap, clutching it protectively. For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the window pane. Cliffhanger. As the door opens, Vivienne greets him in a red dress, but Clara lingers behind her, pale, clutching a drawing pad. While Lancaster's main street glowed with cafe lights and early holiday cheer, the Hayes home sat in quiet contrast, a world apart from the bustle outside. Cars rolled slowly down the wet pavement, their headlights gleaming against the brick storefronts. A diner called the Dutch Rose was full of chatter and laughter, steam rising from mugs of coffee. But behind the closed curtains of the white two-story house on the edge of town, the atmosphere was different, neat, polished, but colder than it appeared. Vivian set the table carefully, her movements brisk and efficient. She liked to present order, the kind that impressed neighbors and reassured her husband. She glanced at the clock, then at Elliot, who was loosening his tie after the drive home. "Sit down, dear. Everything's ready," she said with a practiced smile. Clara had already been told where to sit. She slipped into her chair quietly, folding her hands in her lap. She glanced toward her father but said nothing, her sketchbook tucked away upstairs where it would not be noticed tonight. The dining room carried the warmth of roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh bread. A bottle of red wine breathed in the center of the table, while a tall glass of milk waited untouched before Clara. Elliot sat back, hungry from the day, and let the familiar rituals soothe him. For a while, It was easy to imagine they were simply an ordinary family, sharing an ordinary evening. Vivienne talked freely, filling the silence with her bright voice. She described a new boutique opening in town, mentioned a conversation with the pastor's wife, and outlined her plans for a Thanksgiving gathering. She wanted the house decorated, the food perfect, the guests impressed. "It will be good for us, Elliot. People will see how well we're doing," she said, smiling over her glass. Elliot nodded, answering with short stories from his recent flight. He described an anxious passenger who calmed after takeoff, a crew member who told a joke over the intercom, the way the Atlantic shimmered when the sun broke through clouds. Vivienne laughed at the right places, raising her glass in appreciation. Yet across the table, Clara moved quietly, her fork barely touching her food. She nibbled at a piece of bread, leaving most of her plate untouched. Her eyes drifted often to the far end of the table, to the chair that had once been filled by Margaret. Elliot noticed the way she looked at it, the faint trembling of her lips before she lowered her gaze again. He reached under the table, gently laying his hand over hers. Her small fingers were cool, her knuckles rougher than they should have been for a child. For a moment, he hoped she would meet his eyes, that she would let him in. But she slipped her hand away softly, whispering, "I'm fine, Dad." The words pierced him more deeply than if she had said nothing at all. Vivienne, catching the movement, offered a quick remark. "She's always been a little shy with company." She turned the conversation back to herself, describing a dress she had seen in the boutique window. Dinner ended with plates cleared efficiently by Vivienne. Elliot helped with the breadbasket, carrying it into the kitchen, but she waved him away. "You've flown across the ocean. Go relax," she insisted, smiling again. Elliot walked upstairs with Clara trailing behind. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as though she wished she could stretch the distance between each one. In her bedroom, the curtains were new, the rug soft, but on the desk stood the same framed photograph of Margaret, smiling gently at the camera. Clara paused by it, fingers brushing the frame with a tenderness that made Elliot's throat tighten. He tucked her into bed, smoothing the blanket over her shoulders. "Rest, my girl. Tomorrow's another day," he whispered. Clara nodded, eyes downcast, the sketchbook resting beside her pillow. He kissed her forehead before switching off the lamp, leaving the room in gentle shadows. Downstairs, Vivienne had arranged the living room with the same care she gave to the dining table. A candle flickered on the mantel, and the hum of a jazz record filled the space. She poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to Elliot, settling gracefully onto the sofa beside him. "You should feel proud, Elliot," she said, lifting her glass. "Not many men have what you have: an honored career, a beautiful home, a family." She leaned closer, her perfume drifting between them. "People look up to you. They envy what you've built." Elliot smiled faintly, clinking his glass against hers. "Sometimes I wonder if it's really mine, or if I'm just flying through it all." He chuckled lightly at his own pun, but his eyes drifted upstairs. Vivienne touched his arm. "She'll come around. Clara just needs time." "You're doing everything you can for her." He nodded, but the unease lingered. He excused himself earlier than usual, claiming fatigue from the flight, and went upstairs again. Clara was still awake, her eyes open in the dim light. She quickly closed them when she heard the door creak, pretending to sleep. Elliot sighed softly, kissed her forehead once more, and left the room. The house settled into quiet. Rain tapped gently at the windows, and the old clock in the hallway ticked away the minutes. Clara waited until the footsteps faded, then reached for her sketchbook. She flipped through the pages slowly, each drawing a secret she carried alone. There were pictures of airplanes flying across stormy skies, of small figures waiting under rain, of a woman's gentle smile fading into shadow. She stopped at the newest one, her pencil strokes darker, almost desperate. A little girl standing beneath a downpour, looking up at a sky where the clouds swallowed everything. Her hand trembled as she traced the outline. She wasn't sure why she drew the rain so often, maybe because it felt familiar. Something that matched the chill inside the house. A soft creak startled her. Clara turned quickly, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. In the doorway, Vivienne stood motionless, arms crossed. The faint hallway light framed her figure, and her expression carried no warmth. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough. Clara's heart pounded. She closed the book quickly, sliding it beneath her blanket as though hiding contraband. Vivienne's eyes narrowed slightly, and the silence stretched between them. After a long moment, Vivienne turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Clara sat frozen, her breath shallow. She wanted to call out for her father, to run to his room and tell him everything she held inside. But fear held her in place. She had learned to smile when he was home, to hide the rest when he was away. The rain continued outside, steady and unyielding, a quiet reminder that tomorrow would come with its own burdens. Cliffhanger. Vivian appears in the doorway silently, arms crossed, watching Clara close the book. The following morning in Lancaster dawned gray, the kind of November day when the sky seemed heavy enough to press down on the rooftops. Streets were wet from an overnight drizzle, and shopkeepers wiped rain from their windows before opening. Life moved quietly in town, but around the Hayes house, a different kind of silence lingered. Clara had been sent outside early, long before most children would have been expected to do chores. A basin of laundry sat on the back porch, water sloshing cold against her reddened hands. The chill seeped into her fingers as she rubbed at a shirt with a bar of soap, steam from her breath rising in the air. She didn't complain, not even when the drizzle began again. Her eyes stayed down, shoulders hunched, determined not to draw attention. Through the kitchen window, Vivian watched with folded arms. Her lips were pressed into a line, her eyes cool. To a passerby, she might have seemed composed, even elegant, but the sharpness in her gaze carried something else entirely. She believed she was teaching Clara resilience, or at least that was what she told herself. On the street beyond the hedge, a neighbor named Mrs. Whitaker paused while walking her dog. She frowned at the sight of the young girl kneeling in the damp, scrubbing until her knuckles turned white. "That child's always out there alone when her father's away," she murmured. The words carried only to the dog, but disapproval was written plain on her face. She shook her head and moved on, unwilling to intervene, unwilling to invite trouble in a town where whispers traveled faster than truth. Clara lost her grip on a plate, and it clattered against the stone step, breaking into shards. The sound cut through the drizzle, sharp as thunder. She gasped, kneeling quickly, her little fingers trembling as she gathered the pieces. A bead of blood welled up on her thumb, bright against her pale skin. She pressed it against her damp dress to hide it, afraid of being scolded for clumsiness. From the doorway, Vivian's voice cut through the air, low but firm. "You'll clean the floor tomorrow as well. Perhaps then you'll learn to be careful." There was no softness in her tone, no pause to acknowledge the cut on the girl's hand. Clara nodded silently, blinking back tears, and returned to scrubbing. By the time she finished, her hands were red and raw, her dress damp against her knees. She sat for a moment on the step, staring at the overcast sky. Somewhere far above, planes crossed the gray expanse, invisible but present. She imagined her father among them, guiding the aircraft steady through turbulent skies. She liked to believe that when he looked out the cockpit window, he thought of her. Inside, Vivian poured herself a glass of wine even though it was not yet noon. She turned on a radio station that played soft music, letting the warmth of the living room contrast with the chill outside. She was satisfied, convinced discipline would serve Clara better than indulgence. Clara, though, carried the ache of loneliness like a second skin. She returned inside, careful to dry her hands before touching the doorknob. Her eyes darted toward the stairs, knowing her father was away again, flying somewhere over the ocean. She held back the urge to whisper his name, to ask the empty air for comfort. Instead, she crept to her room, shut the door, and opened her sketchbook. The page filled with lines almost on its own, a child kneeling in the rain, surrounded by broken pieces of something fragile. Above her, the clouds darkened, while far in the sky a small plane traced a line toward home. The afternoon stretched on in muted tones. Lancaster streets grew busier as school let out, children laughing beneath umbrellas, their boots splashing in shallow puddles. Clara heard their voices faintly from her bedroom window. She watched them for a moment, pressing her cheek to the cool glass, her eyes following their bright coats and backpacks as they disappeared down the block. She wondered what it felt like to run freely in the rain without fear, to laugh instead of shiver. Her stomach grumbled, but she ignored it. Instead, she flipped another page in her sketchbook. This time she drew her mother's face, not with precise detail, but with soft outlines, the kind of memory a child clings to when photographs begin to fade. She shaded the eyes gently, careful not to press too hard, as if any mistake might erase the memory altogether. Downstairs, Vivian entertained a guest. A woman from the neighborhood had stopped by with a pie, hoping to share a recipe. Vivian welcomed her warmly, showing her the spotless kitchen, pouring coffee, speaking in tones that suggested harmony and grace. "Clara is upstairs working on her homework," Vivian said smoothly when asked. "She's a bright girl. I make sure she stays disciplined." The neighbor nodded, reassured, and later left with a smile. To anyone beyond these walls, the Hayes home was the picture of order. But upstairs, Clara lay curled on her bed, the sketchbook against her chest, her hands aching. She listened to the footsteps fading, to the clink of cups being rinsed. The contrast between the cheerful voices below and the heaviness in her chest was sharp enough to make her bite her lip until it hurt. That evening, the drizzle turned into steady rain. Elliot was still away, flying another route, unaware of how the house truly felt in his absence. Clara slipped downstairs to refill her glass of milk, careful not to make a sound. She froze when she saw Vivienne standing in the hallway, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "You should be asleep," Vivienne said, her tone soft but edged. "I was thirsty," Clara whispered. Vivienne stepped closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood. She brushed a strand of hair from Clara's face with a hand that looked gentle but felt heavy with authority. "Then drink quickly. And remember, good girls don't linger in the kitchen at night." Clara nodded, clutching the glass tightly. She drank in hurried gulps, then placed it back on the counter, retreating without another word. When she reached her room, she closed the door and leaned against it, her small shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. The rain tapped harder at the window. She returned to the sketchbook, opening to the page of her mother's face. She whispered softly, "I wish you were here." Then she traced the lines once more, adding a faint smile to lips that in her memory had always spoken gently. Later, when she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed of standing on the covered bridge outside town, her father's plane circling overhead, lowering as though it might land just for her. She reached up, stretching her arms wide, but woke before she could touch it. The next morning, Lancaster's church bells rang in the distance as the town came alive again. Farmers brought produce to market, shopkeepers arranged their windows with Thanksgiving displays, and life moved forward. Inside the Hayes home, Vivian placed fresh flowers on the dining table. To any visitor, the house radiated hospitality and charm. But Clara, standing quietly in the hallway, knew a different truth. She pressed her bandaged finger against the edge of her sketchbook, her eyes carrying the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. Cliffhanger. A neighbor remarks softly to another, "That child is always out there alone when her father's away," and both women shake their heads before walking on. The rain eased overnight, leaving Lancaster wrapped in a misty calm. By morning, puddles mirrored the bare trees lining the neighborhood streets, and the crisp scent of wet earth hung in the air. Elliot returned earlier than expected, the drive from Philadelphia quiet, save for the hum of the tires and his own thoughts. He had hoped for a warm welcome, the kind that could erase the miles he had just crossed. But the moment he entered the house, something felt slightly off. Vivian greeted him with her usual poise, her hair arranged perfectly, her voice bright. She asked about his flight, poured him coffee, and told him about neighbors planning a community dinner. Yet beneath the surface of her cheerful chatter, Elliot noticed a subtle sharpness. He glanced toward the stairs, wondering where Clara was. He found her upstairs, sitting at her desk by the window. The mist outside blurred the world, but Clara wasn't watching it. She was bent over her sketchbook, pencil moving quietly across the page. When Elliot stepped into the room, she startled and closed the book too quickly. He caught a glimpse of the drawing before the cover snapped shut, an image of a child in the rain, shoulders hunched, eyes turned upward toward a plane. "Can I see?" he asked gently. Clara shook her head, clutching the sketchbook tighter. "It's just practice," she whispered. Her voice carried more weight than her words, as though she feared revealing too much. Elliot crouched beside her chair, studying her pale face. Her hands showed faint redness at the knuckles, as though they had been rubbed raw. He wanted to ask, to press, but the quiet wall she built around herself felt too fragile to push against. Instead, he touched her shoulder lightly and said, "You know, your mother used to draw too. You have her gift." At the mention of her mother, Clara's eyes flickered, glistening for a moment before she lowered her gaze. She nodded without speaking, then tucked the sketchbook under her pillow. Later that evening, Elliot wandered into the attic, searching for an old suitcase. The air smelled of cedar and dust, sunlight slanting through a small window. As he moved boxes aside, he discovered one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were Margaret's belongings, carefully folded scarves, a locket, letters tied with ribbon. Beneath them lay a sealed envelope marked with his name. His breath caught, and for a long moment, he simply stared. Downstairs, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, restless. She opened her sketchbook again, drawing lines with quick, nervous strokes. The sound of the attic floor creaking above gave her pause. She wondered if her father would find the things her mother had left behind, wondered if he might finally understand the silence she carried. Elliot held the envelope in his hands. The seal was unbroken, the paper yellowed slightly with time. He traced Margaret's handwriting with his thumb, a shiver running through him. He almost opened it but stopped, sliding it back into the box. His heart wasn't ready for whatever truth it might hold. That night, as the clock ticked softly in the hallway, Elliot sat in the living room. Vivian chatted about holiday plans, her voice filling the air, but his mind was elsewhere. Upstairs, a child slept with a sketchbook beneath her pillow, and in the attic above them, a letter waited, silent and unopened. Morning light filtered through thin curtains, spilling across Clara's room. She stirred awake, rubbing her eyes, and saw her father sitting in the chair near her desk. He had dozed off while waiting, his head tilted back slightly, his uniform jacket draped over the armrest. For a moment, she studied him in silence, almost daring to believe that he would never leave again. When Elliot opened his eyes, he found Clara watching him. He smiled faintly, reaching for her hand. "I thought I'd keep you company," he said. "You always seem so quiet when I get back." Clara hesitated, then opened her sketchbook and slid it toward him. On the page was another drawing, a child holding a broken dish, hands bleeding faintly, rain pouring overhead. Elliot's stomach tightened. "Is this how you feel?" he asked softly. She lowered her gaze, her voice nearly a whisper. "Sometimes." Before he could ask more, Vivian's voice called from downstairs. "Breakfast is ready." Clara flinched, closing the book quickly, and slipped past him without answering. Elliot remained seated, staring at the closed sketchbook, a heaviness growing in his chest. At the table, Vivian served eggs and toast with her usual grace. She chatted about decorations for the upcoming holiday, about guests she hoped to impress. Elliot barely listened, his eyes fixed on Clara, who pushed her food around the plate without eating. When he tried to ask about school, she answered in clipped phrases. Her eyes stayed down, guarded. After breakfast, Elliot stepped outside for air. The neighborhood was alive with small sounds. A neighbor sweeping her porch, church bells tolling in the distance, children kicking a ball in the street. He greeted Mrs. Whitaker, who waved politely but looked at him with eyes that carried something unspoken. He wondered what she knew, what she might have seen when he wasn't there. Later, Elliot returned to the attic. He opened the box again, lifting Margaret's scarves to reveal the sealed envelope. His fingers shook as he held it, but once more he slipped it back into the box, unable to cross the threshold of truth. The weight of it lingered with him, a question unanswered. That evening, Clara retreated to her room after dinner. Elliot followed, knocking softly before stepping inside. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. She nodded. He pulled up a chair and noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the pages of her sketchbook. Gently, he slid it free. It was a drawing of an airplane flying above a small girl standing alone in a field. The figure's hand was raised toward the sky, as though reaching for something that could never descend. His throat tightened. "You know," he said carefully, "planes always return to land. They never stay in the sky forever." Clara glanced at him, her eyes shimmering, then looked away. She didn't speak, but her silence told him more than words could. Downstairs, Vivienne arranged flowers in a vase, humming. The house looked beautiful, orderly, everything in place. Yet above, a father and daughter sat in a room where memories of the past weighed heavier than the present. As Elliot left the room later, he paused at the top of the stairs, listening to the soft scratch of Clara's pencil as she returned to her sketchbook. The sound carried a message he couldn't yet decipher, but he knew it was meant for him. Cliffhanger. Elliot finds Margaret's old box in the attic, a sealed envelope inside, his name written on it. The November afternoon settled over Lancaster with a muted weight. Clouds pressed low against the sky, heavy and gray, while the wind swept through the bare trees that lined the streets. Farmers' stalls at the market closed early, their produce packed away under canvas tarps as the drizzle turned steady once again. Thanksgiving banners fluttered weakly on lampposts, their colors dulled by the damp. Elliot walked alongside Clara through the marketplace before the vendors shuttered completely. He had promised her a cup of hot chocolate from the small stand by the square, a simple treat he thought might lift her spirits. Clara wrapped her hands around the steaming paper cup, holding it close for warmth. Elliot noticed the skin of her fingers red, with tiny cracks that looked too harsh for a child her age. "Did you hurt yourself?" he asked gently. She shook her head, staring down into the swirl of whipped cream. "It's nothing, Dad." Her voice carried the same practiced quiet he had grown used to. Elliot's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, yet the rawness of her hands told another story. As they walked back to the car, a neighbor approached. Mrs. Whitaker pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, her dog tugging impatiently at the leash. "Captain Hayes," she greeted warmly. "Home again." "Just got in," Elliot answered with a tired smile. The woman's eyes flicked to Clara, who stood close to her father, clutching the cup as though it might anchor her. "You should be proud," Mrs. Whitaker said, "though I do wonder. I've seen her outside in the rain sometimes, doing chores. It didn't seem right." Elliot's smile faltered. "I'll look into it," he replied softly. Mrs. Whitaker nodded and moved on, leaving the words to settle like stones in his stomach. At home, Vivian greeted them with her usual flourish, her voice rising above the sound of the radio. "I've been preparing for next week," she said, showing Elliot a table runner she had purchased for the holiday. "We'll make a fine impression. People should see how well our family is doing." Ugh. Later, after dinner, Elliot found Clara in her room, seated cross-legged on the floor. She was coloring quietly, the sketchbook balanced on her knees. When he entered, she quickly shut it, pressing her hand over the cover, as though to guard its secrets. "You draw a lot," he said carefully. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. Something inside him stirred a mix of sorrow and unease. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You don't have to hide it, Clara. I'd like to see what you're working on sometime." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, but she said nothing. That night, when the house quieted and Vivian had retired to their room with a book, Elliot slipped into the attic once more. The box waited where he had left it, Margaret's handwriting still fresh in his memory. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the sealed envelope again. This time, he didn't put it back. He tore the flap carefully, the paper fragile beneath his fingers. Inside lay a letter written in Margaret's flowing script. His eyes scanned the first line, his breath catching in his chest. "My dearest Elliot, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. There is something you must know about Clara." The attic was silent except for the faint groan of the rafters. Elliot sat on a wooden trunk, Margaret's letter trembling in his hands. He read slowly, his breath shallow, the words sinking into him like stones into deep water. "Clara is yours in every way. I never told you, Elliot, because I feared the weight of your work, the distances you always carried. I worried you might feel trapped or resentful, but she is your daughter. She carries your smile, your eyes when she looks up at the sky. If you doubt, look at her drawings. She places you in the clouds because she has always felt you there. Elliot lowered the paper, pressing his palm to his forehead. A rush of memories surfaced Clara's quiet glances, the way she clung to him at the door, the drawings he had barely glimpsed but never asked enough about. He felt the ground tilt beneath him, as though the storm gathering outside had already found its way inside his chest. He rose, pacing the small attic. Dust swirled in the beam of light from the window, but he barely noticed. Margaret's words wrapped around him, filling every corner of his mind. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, building a future, providing stability. Yet how much had he missed, blinded by his own certainty? Downstairs, the faint notes of music floated up from the living room. Vivian hummed along to the record player, pouring herself another glass of wine. The house seemed peaceful, orderly. But Elliot knew better now. He carried proof in his hands that the life he had pieced together was more fragile than it appeared. He folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. He would not speak of it tonight, not yet. His heart needed time to absorb what he had learned. Still, He felt a new fire rising inside him, a determination he had not known in years. Later, when he tucked Clara into bed, he lingered. She was already drifting toward sleep, the sketchbook beside her pillow. He brushed a lock of hair from her forehead and whispered, "You're not alone, sweetheart. Not anymore." Clara stirred, murmuring something unintelligible, and curled closer to the blanket. Elliot remained for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath. When he returned downstairs, Vivienne looked up from the sofa. "You've been quiet tonight," she observed. "Just tired," Elliot answered. His voice sounded steady, though inside he felt anything but. Vivienne studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Rest then. Tomorrow will be busy." She lifted her glass again, as though sealing the evening with finality. But Elliot couldn't rest. He stood by the window long after she had gone upstairs. Outside, thunder grumbled distantly, rolling across the farmland. The air felt charged, heavy, with a storm not yet broken. He pressed his hand against the glass, staring out into the darkness, and thought of Margaret's words. "She places you in the clouds because she has always felt you there." The sound of thunder rumbled again as his eyes returned to the final line, the words that burned into him with an almost physical force. "Elliot, she is yours." The storm swept into Lancaster with little warning, the sky turning black long before evening. Clouds rolled heavy over the fields, and rain lashed against rooftops with a fury unusual even for November. Lightning cracked across the horizon, illuminating the steeple of the old church before plunging it back into shadow. Elliot's flight schedule had shifted unexpectedly. A cancellation in Lisbon gave him 2 days at home, an unexpected gift he intended to surprise Clara with. He drove through sheets of rain, wipers struggling to keep pace, headlights carving narrow paths through the watery dark. His heart lightened at the thought of Clara's face when she saw him arrive early. He pictured her laughter, the way she sometimes ran into his arms, burying her face against his chest. But as he turned onto their street, another sound cut through the storm, the sharp clatter of dishes against metal. At first, he thought it was debris rattling in the wind. Then he slowed, his headlights sweeping across the driveway, and saw movement in the backyard. He stepped out into the rain, uniform jacket quickly soaked through. Water streamed down his face as he moved toward the sound. What he saw froze him in place. Clara sat hunched on a wooden stool, her small frame drenched, her hair plastered against her cheeks. A metal basin overflowed with rainwater as she tried to scrub plates, her hands red and trembling from the cold. The sponge slipped repeatedly from her grasp, clattering back into the dirty water. She kept her head down, too weary to cry, too resigned to resist. For a moment, Elliot couldn't breathe. He looked toward the house, and there she was, Vivienne, standing at the window, arms folded, watching with calm detachment. The glow from the living room behind her only sharpened the chill of her expression. "Faster, Clara." Vivienne's voice cut through the rain, muffled but clear. "There are still glasses to finish." Clara flinched and nodded, scrubbing harder though her hands barely obeyed. Her lips moved as though whispering something to herself, a prayer or a plea the storm carried away. Elliot dropped his bag. It hit the stones with a dull thud, water splashing around it. He rushed forward, kneeling beside Clara. "Sweetheart," he cried, gathering her in his arms. She startled, eyes wide, before she realized who held her. "Dad?" she whispered, voice small, nearly drowned by the rain. "Yes, I'm here," he said, pulling his jacket around her shivering body. The fabric was already soaked, but he held her close, desperate to give warmth he no longer had. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, trembling violently. I just wanted her to love me," she stammered, words cracking as tears mingled with the rain. "Like you do." The sentence hit him harder than the storm. Elliot pressed his lips to her damp hair, choking back his own tears. "You don't have to earn love, Clara. Not from me. Never from me." From the window, Vivienne's figure remained, still as stone. Even as Elliot turned with his daughter in his arms, he saw no sign of regret, only irritation at being discovered. He carried Clara through the downpour, kicking the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the warmth of the house seemed obscene after what he had witnessed outside. Water pooled at his feet, his uniform plastered to his skin, Clara's small body trembling against him. Vivienne stood calmly in the doorway to the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. "Really, Elliot," she said coolly, "you're overreacting." She needs to learn responsibility. I won't raise a spoiled child." Elliot's chest heaved. His voice was low, broken, but it filled the space like thunder. "She's 9 years old. 9. And you left her in a storm. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, too exhausted to hear more. He stroked her hair, steadying himself against the rage that surged through him. The living room was dim, the lamplight soft against the storm pounding the windows. Yet nothing about the moment felt gentle. Elliot stood dripping on the hardwood floor. Clara curled into him like a fragile bird, while Vivienne's gaze cut sharp as glass. "Don't be dramatic," she said, setting her glass down with deliberate calm. "It was just a little rain. My mother raised me the same way. Hardship makes a person strong." Elliot's voice thundered louder than the storm. "This isn't strength, it's cruelty. She's a child, Vivienne. My child." The last words slipped out before he could stop them. Vivienne blinked, the mask of confidence faltering. "Your child?" she repeated slowly. "What are you talking about?" But Elliot couldn't back away from the truth anymore. Margaret's letter echoed in his mind. "She is yours. In every way. Look at her drawings." He looked down at Clara, who clung tighter, as though sensing the ground shifting beneath them all. "I failed her once," he whispered, his throat raw. "I won't do it again." Vivienne's face hardened. "Failed? Don't twist this, Elliot. You're never here. You come and go, like a guest in your own home. And I'm the one left to manage her moods, her stubbornness, her sadness. Do you think bedtime stories and hot chocolate will fix everything? She needs discipline, not coddling." Elliot's heart pounded, torn between anger and guilt. She was right about one thing: he had been gone too often, hiding in his work, in the safety of airports and flight schedules. But discipline wasn't what Clara had needed. She had needed him. He set Clara gently on the couch, wrapping her in a blanket. Her eyes fluttered open, tired but searching, as though she wanted to be sure he would not vanish again. "Rest, sweetheart," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Then he turned back to Vivienne, his shoulders squared, his voice steady now with a strength that surprised even him. "I trusted you," he said. "I thought you'd care for her while I was gone. But you've mistaken cruelty for guidance. That ends tonight. Ever." Vivienne drew in a sharp breath, her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. "And what then? You'll do it all yourself? Between flights and hotels and God knows where?" "Don't be naive, Elliot. You can't keep her safe, not when you're gone half the time." "I'll change that," he answered simply. The words felt like a vow, heavier than any oath he had ever taken in uniform. Vivienne shook her head, her composure finally slipping, a flash of fear darting across her face. "If you walk away from me, you'll regret it. Don't think you can manage everything on your own." Elliot stepped closer, his voice low but unyielding. "What I regret is not seeing sooner. I regret every night she cried herself to sleep while I convinced myself she was fine. But I won't regret choosing her over convenience. She's my daughter, and she deserves better." The silence that followed was punctuated only by the roar of the storm outside. Clara shifted on the couch, her small voice breaking the heavy air. "Daddy?" "Elliot can't be here," taking her hand. "Yes, sweetheart." Her lips trembled. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" The question pierced him. He cupped her hand in both of his, meeting her gaze. "Yes, Clara. From now on, I'll be here. I promise." The thunder outside cracked so loudly the window panes rattled. Elliot gathered Clara into his arms once more, holding her, as though to shield her from both the storm outside and the storm within their walls. Upstairs, the old house groaned, and Vivienne's footsteps retreated, sharp and quick, like someone escaping a truth too heavy to carry. Elliot remained where he was, rocking gently with Clara in his arms, the storm pounding against the house as if to bear witness. He knew nothing would ever be the same after this night. For the first time in years, he felt both the crushing weight and the liberating clarity of responsibility. The storm outside raged on, but inside, in the warmth of his embrace, Clara whispered a single word before sleep claimed her, home. And with that, Elliot realized the battle had only begun, but the choice had already been made. Morning broke gently after the night's chaos. The storm had moved east, leaving the fields around Lancaster glistening under pale sunlight. Puddles mirrored the bare trees, and the air carried the sharp, clean scent of washed earth. From the church nearby, bells chimed the hour, their sound steady and reassuring. Elliot rose early, though sleep had barely touched him. He moved quietly about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a small bowl of berries he found in the fridge. It wasn't much, but he wanted Clara to wake to something warm, something ordinary, something safe. Clara shuffled into the kitchen wrapped in her blanket, her hair tousled, her eyes heavy from the night before. She blinked at the table, then at him, as if unsure the scene was real. "I made breakfast," Elliot said softly. "Just us today." She slid into a chair, her blanket slipping from her shoulders. When he set the plate before her, she hesitated, then whispered, "Are you really not leaving?" He sat opposite her, folding his hands. "I'm not leaving, Clara. Not today, not tomorrow. Things will be different now." Her eyes searched his face, trying to decide whether to believe him. At last, she picked up her fork and took a bite. The smallest smile appeared, fragile but true. Later, while Clara drew in her sketchbook on the porch, Elliot made a phone call from the hallway. His voice was quiet but firm. "This is Captain Elliot Hayes. I need to speak with scheduling. I'm requesting extended leave." "Yes, personal reasons. Family." The word family landed heavy, grounding him in a way it never had before. He hung up, exhaling deeply. His whole career had been built on discipline, precision, and control, but none of those things had given him what truly mattered. He wasn't sure how long he could afford the leave, or what it meant for his future. But he knew he couldn't lose another moment with Clara. In the afternoon, they visited the town square. The Thanksgiving festival had been delayed by the storm, but was back in motion. Children chased one another between vendor stalls, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the air. A brass band played from the gazebo, their cheerful notes cutting through the chilly wind. Clara walked beside him, her small hand tucked into his. For the first time in a long while, she didn't hold back. She pointed out the decorated pumpkins, the string lights crisscrossing above, even a stray dog wagging its tail near the food stand. "You like it here?" Elliot asked. She nodded. "It feels like everyone belongs." He squeezed her hand gently. "And so do you." They bought 2 cups of hot cider. Elliot handed a few bills to the vendor and added, almost automatically, "Keep the change." The man tipped his cap in thanks. Such small gestures, ordinary, unnoticed, suddenly felt rich with meaning. As they sat on a bench sipping cider, Clara opened her sketchbook and showed him a new drawing. It was of a plane, but this time there were 2 figures inside the cockpit, a man and a child, side by side, both smiling. Elliot's throat tightened. He brushed his thumb across the page, careful not to smudge the pencil lines. "It's beautiful," he said. "Is that us?" Clara nodded shyly, her cheeks warming. He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we'll make it real." "Oh." For the first time in years, Elliot felt like he was steering his life not through coordinates and flight paths, but through love. The late afternoon sun stretched low over the rooftops when Elliot guided Clara toward his car. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest, reluctant to close it even as they slid into their seats. The page with the drawing of the plane remained half exposed, as though she wanted the world to see what she had created. Instead of heading home, Elliot drove west along the familiar country road. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, drifting from chimneys of farmhouses. Clara peered out the window, watching the landscape roll past barns painted red, silos rising tall, fields lying fallow until spring. "Where are we going?" she asked at last. "To see your grandparents," Elliot replied. His voice was steady but carried a note of hesitation. "It's been a long time. Too long." Clara tilted her head, uncertain. "Grandma and Grandpa?" "Yes," he said quietly. "They're good people. I think they'll be very glad to meet you." The farmhouse appeared at the end of the gravel lane, its white paint weathered but welcoming. A porch swing moved gently in the breeze, and a line of corn stalks saved from the harvest stood bundled as decoration near the steps. Elliot parked, cutting the engine. For a moment he didn't move. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, breath shallow. Memories pressed in. His father's stern lectures, his mother's patient smiles, the arguments when he had chosen the sky over a steady life. He had not brought Clara here before, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear. Clara touched his sleeve. "Are you okay, Dad?" He nodded, forcing a smile. "Better than okay. Let's go." When he knocked, the door opened almost instantly. His mother, Eleanor, stood framed in the glow of the kitchen behind her. Her hair was silver now, her eyes sharp but softening the moment they landed on him. "Elliot," she breathed. Then her gaze fell to Clara, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my." Clara stepped half behind him, clutching her sketchbook tighter. Elliot placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, this is Clara, my daughter." Silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the porch boards beneath their feet. Then Eleanor bent down slowly, her voice trembling. "Clara, sweetheart, may I hug you?" Clara's eyes flicked to Elliot, who gave a small nod. She stepped forward, and Eleanor wrapped her in a careful embrace, tears spilling freely. "Come in," she urged, her voice breaking. "Both of you, come in." Inside, the farmhouse smelled of apple pie cooling on the counter. Elliot's father, Robert, emerged from the living room. He was taller, broad-shouldered despite his age, his expression serious, as always. But when he saw Clara, something softened. "So," he said gruffly, "this is why you're finally home for more than a night." Elliot braced himself, expecting judgment. But Robert only cleared his throat and reached for Clara's hand. "Welcome, young lady. We've got plenty of space for you here." Clara looked up at him, startled, then smiled faintly. The evening unfolded slowly, with stories and questions, laughter and quiet pauses. Clara sat at the table between her grandparents, listening as Eleanor fussed over her, offering pie and warm milk. Robert asked about school, her favorite subjects, her drawings. For each answer, Clara grew more confident, her voice stronger, her eyes brighter. Elliot watched in awe. It felt as though a missing piece of his life had slid back into place. The farmhouse, once heavy with unspoken regrets, now rang with a lighter sound, the beginning of something new. When the night grew late, Eleanor pressed a quilt into Elliot's hands. "Take this for her bed," she said softly. "Your grandmother stitched it when you were a boy. I always thought it would end up back in your house." Elliot's throat tightened. "Thank you, Mom." As they prepared to leave, Clara hugged Eleanor tightly, then looked up at her. "Can we come back again soon?" Eleanor's eyes glistened. "Any time, darling. Any time at all." And back in the car, Clara nestled beneath the quilt, drifting toward sleep. Elliot started the engine, glancing once more at the farmhouse, glowing in the dark. For the first time in years, he felt like he had brought something precious home, not just for himself, but for his daughter. And as the road carried them back toward town, Elliot knew the hardest choices still lay ahead. But tonight had shown him that healing was possible, that family could mend what had once been broken. The question now was whether he had the courage to keep choosing it, day after day. Thanksgiving morning arrived crisp and bright. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasted turkey drifting from kitchen windows. Lancaster's main street bustled with neighbors carrying pies and baskets, their voices warm as they called greetings to one another. Flags and autumn garlands fluttered against storefronts, and the old church bell rang 9 o'clock, marking the start of the holiday. At the Hayes house, Elliot moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing stuffing and checking the oven. He had insisted on cooking this year, determined to make the day his own. Clara stood on a chair beside him, carefully stirring cranberry sauce. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon Eleanor had given her the night before. "You're a natural," Elliot said, watching her stir with careful concentration. She giggled softly. "Grandma said the secret is patience." She's right," Elliot replied, smiling. He reached out to steady the bowl when it wobbled. "And maybe a steady hand." The morning passed with an ease Elliot hadn't known in years. No rushing to pack, no phone calls from the airline, no pressure beyond the simple joy of being present. He felt clumsy at times, burning the rolls, spilling flour on the counter, but Clara laughed at each mistake. And somehow the laughter mattered more than perfection. By noon, Eleanor and Robert arrived carrying pies and fresh bread. They filled the small house with warmth and chatter, unpacking dishes, rearranging chairs, and fussing over Clara as if she had always been theirs. She beamed beneath the attention, her cheeks pink, her eyes bright. After the meal, when the table was cleared and the adults lingered with coffee, Clara slipped away. Elliot found her on the porch, sketchbook in her lap. She looked up when he stepped outside, then pushed the book toward him shyly. On the page was a new drawing, a house with smoke curling from its chimney, 4 figures standing together out front: Elliot, Clara, Eleanor, and Robert. Above them, the sky stretched wide, no planes in sight. Elliot's chest tightened. "This is beautiful, Clara." She studied him seriously. "Do you think it can stay like this? Us together?" He crouched beside her, placing a hand over hers. "It can, but it will take work. And I'll do that work every day to make sure you know you're never alone again." Clara's eyes glistened. She leaned into him, whispering, "That's all I ever wanted." The wind rustled the last of the autumn leaves across the porch steps. For the first time, Elliot felt as though the season wasn't about endings, but beginnings. Inside, Eleanor called them back to the table for dessert. Clara tucked her sketchbook under her arm and followed Elliot, her steps lighter than they had been in months. That evening, after the dishes were washed and the last of the pie tucked away, Elliot stepped outside. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving a wash of violet and gold over the quiet streets of Lancaster. The church bells rang once more, their tones carrying across the rooftops, as if to mark not just the end of a holiday, but the beginning of something new. Clara joined him on the porch, wrapped in the quilt Eleanor had given her. She leaned against his side, her small head resting just below his shoulder. "It feels different tonight," she murmured. Elliot looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That's because it is different. We're not just getting through anymore, Clara. We're starting again." She tilted her face upward, eyes wide with the kind of trust children give only once they believe it's safe. "You mean it?" "I do," he said simply. "No more broken promises, no more silence. Just us and family and whatever future we build together." She nestled closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I'm not afraid anymore." The words struck him with quiet force. He thought of Margaret's letter, of nights he had chosen the sky over the hearth, of all the times Clara had hidden her pain behind drawings and silence. And he thought of this moment, fragile but real, where healing finally began. The neighbors' houses glowed with warm light. Families gathered inside around fireplaces and laughter. Elliot found himself grateful for the ordinary sounds, the clink of dishes, a child's laugh carried on the wind, the faint hum of a car pulling into a driveway. Ordinary had never seemed so extraordinary. Inside, Eleanor and Robert tidied the kitchen. Elliot could hear his mother humming an old hymn, his father's voice low as he stacked plates. For the first time in decades, the Hayes home felt full again. Elliot took a deep breath, the night air cool and sharp in his lungs. He turned to Clara. "You've given me more than I ever gave you, a chance to see what really matters." She frowned slightly, not understanding, but smiled anyway. "You gave me a home." He kissed her forehead, holding her close as the quilt slipped down over both of them. The wind rustled the last leaves from the trees, carrying them down the street like tiny messengers of change. Later, when he tucked Clara into bed, she opened her sketchbook one last time. On the fresh page was a new drawing, a plane no longer alone in the sky but grounded on a runway, with figures walking hand in hand toward it. Above, in careful block letters, she had written one word, home. Elliot's throat tightened. He whispered, "That's the most beautiful flight plan I've ever seen." When she drifted to sleep, he sat beside her for a long time, the quiet of the house wrapping around him. He realized the storms, both in the sky and in his life, had finally cleared. What lay ahead wouldn't be simple, but it would be worth every step. And if anyone had asked him then what mattered most, uniforms, miles, applause, he would have answered without hesitation. A daughter's smile, a family's table, the steady, unshakable love that anchors us when everything else feels uncertain. Because redemption was not found in the skies he had chased for so long. It was here, in the warmth of a quilt, in a child's whispered trust, in the strength of a family finally made whole. And so, after many storms both in the skies and within the heart, Elliot found his true landing place, not on distant runways, but at the simple table of family. A pilot's uniform, the applause of strangers, the endless miles traveled, none of it could heal what had been broken. It was in the trust of a child, the embrace of parents, and the warmth of home that he discovered the real measure of a man. This story reminds us that love, once forgotten, can be found again, that even the deepest regrets can be softened by the courage to return, to admit mistakes, and to choose differently. Redemption is not about grand gestures. It is about small, faithful acts repeated day after day, like serving breakfast on a quiet morning, listening to a child's laughter, or staying home when it matters most. Perhaps, as you listen, you are reminded of your own kitchen table long ago, the smell of fresh bread, the clatter of dishes, the voices of those you loved. Or perhaps you think of the times when distance, pride, or silence built walls within your family. If so, let this story be a gentle nudge. It is never too late to mend, never too late to call, to forgive, to show up. The lesson is simple. Unconditional kindness can change the course of a life. Everyone deserves to be loved and to belong. Human connection is worth far more than titles, money, or applause. Happiness is born when we live not only for ourselves, but for those who share our journey. And just as a small lamp in a farmhouse window can guide a traveler home on a dark night, so can a single act of care light the way through life's hardest hours. So, dear friends, take a moment to think of your own family, your own circle of love. Is there someone you might reach out to today? A word spoken, a hand held, a visit made. These are the real treasures that outlast everything else. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. If you think it could have been told better, leave a 0 and share your thoughts. Either way, may it spark a memory, a conversation, a renewed promise to those you hold dear. Because in the end, what remains is not the storm, but the home we build with love.